every conversation is different.
Is there absolute truth in matters of ethics or morality or maybe even spiritual things?
There are patterns, there are themes, there's things that come up a lot.
Jesus turns an everyday conversation into something
You
spiritual.
just got to be in the moment and take it where God takes it. This week on the Reach Podcast, my guest today is David Morgan. David is on the staff of Search Ministries in Dallas, Texas, and he is also their Associate Director of Staff Training. David, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Love it, Blaine. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into your conversation today, give us just a little bit of an overview of what you do with Search in Dallas.
Yeah, we spend our time inviting adults to take a next step towards God, and we do that by with relationships, and we train along the way of inviting folks to do that who don't know Jesus. We also train a whole bunch of folks in Dallas to be able to share their faith as well.
Well, it sounds awesome, and because of that, it's one of the reasons why I asked you to be here today, because I know you've got great conversations you're having all the time with people who have questions about Jesus, and so why don't you set up a recent conversation that we're going to kind of talk through today?
Sure. We had a guy went through our training to be able to help share his faith, and he invited a friend of his to one of our open forums, and place where people can ask questions and have conversations about life's big questions and God. And so I'm going to change this guy's name. I hope I remember it the whole time because he's become a friend. A guy named Bill came to one of the open forums. And Bill and I had a lot in common, which was great because now we can become friends. And if you're friends, you can talk about anything. And so Bill and I had basketball in common. It was obvious for him. He's about 6'7", and it's not as obvious for me. But yeah, I used to coach basketball, and so I knew a bunch of guys who he played against and coached with and coached him, and it was a great start to a conversation.
So where were you when you're having the conversation that we're going to look into?
The first conversation was at a restaurant, and it was in the big group. But after that, we just went to a coffee shop because he had more questions. My favorite thing that I think he said early when I didn't really know him was a guy in our forum conversation looked at him at some point, and he was pretty argumentative but nice. Bill was. And the guy goes, well, I think at some point, Bill, you just got to believe. And he stopped and looked at me and goes, well, why? And what would I believe in anyway? So, no, I don't have to believe anything, as a matter of fact, which I thought was a really interesting way to answer the question. And so that led to a further conversation between me and him that got pretty interesting.
So it kind of got him thinking. It allowed you to have a follow-up meeting, grabbing a cup of coffee. So you're sitting down. I think for a lot of people, the question is going to be like, just how do you get into spiritual stuff? Even in that kind of a setting, how do you make the move?
That's a good question. I think it is one of the key things is how do I turn, it's really the story of the woman at the well, right? Jesus turns an everyday conversation into something spiritual. And I just look for opportunities to do that. I pray about it, and I try to see the world through the lens of how can I take this conversation to a different level. And it was easy with him because he brought it up in that. And then so for me, all I had to do afterwards, after the lunch meeting when he said that, is I said, man, what you said was really interesting to me. And I'd love to just have a longer conversation and hear why you think what you think, and maybe just just be willing to talk about this thing.
Sure. So when you got together, how'd that go?
I mean, great. I just said, I try not to, I didn't want to get engaged in a whole bunch of small talk. I figured there'd be time for that if you wanted to. And so the conversation continues, and then it was over 2 or 3 different coffee meetings that we had. And finally at one of them, he said, well, you know, I don't even understand how you know any of this stuff is true. And he was going down the road of, that might be true for you, but it's just not true for me. And I said, hey, do you mind if I ask you like a little bit deeper question? He goes, sure, you can ask me anything. I said, well, do you think there's such a thing as absolute truth? He had already alluded to the fact that he was at least open to the idea that there might be room in his thinking for there to be a God. So I already knew we were there. And so I said, do you think there's such a thing as absolute truth about anything? And he went, well, yeah, like 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4, and gravity. He had the normal kind of conversation. Sure. That's a typical way to look at it. I said, yeah, I get that. That's easy. I said, what about, is there absolute truth in matters of ethics or morality or maybe even spiritual things? And he goes, no, it's not possible. No way. No way you can say that this is absolutely true. And I said, and this is where I have tended over the course of my life until I got involved with Search. That felt like I got you moment. because the answer is you've just made an absolute statement about absolute truth. So you've kind of disproven what you believe. And so in that moment, I've learned that I have to really concentrate to be kind, and rather than being right, propose an idea to be possible. And so that's what I did. I just said, well, can I comment on that? He said, sure. I said, you've kind of made an absolute statement about absolute truth. And he sat there, and you could just watch it hit him. And before he said anything, I could tell it was okay. I wasn't interrupting his thought. I said, and you've already said that there might be room in your thinking for God to exist, right? And he said, yeah, for sure. I said, so I wonder if there is absolute truth about anything in those realms we talked about, and there is possibility that God exists, I would think if he does exist, that there might be some absolute truths about him. And he sat there and he goes, yeah, you might be right. And I said, and I wonder if that's true, what those things might be, because it seems like that might be really, really important.
Wow.
And
you got him thinking.
He's thinking, right? And we're engaged in a real conversation with someone that we have lots of stuff, and we've talked basketball and life and where he is, and I've listened to his commentary for weeks now without really even proposing that I have answers to your questions, but that I'm just trying to get you to think.
Hey everybody, I wanted to take a moment and let you know that the Reach podcast is brought to you by Search, a ministry dedicated to sharing Jesus through friendships and conversations for nearly 50 years. Learn more or get involved at searchnational.org. Let me ask you a question. Sorry to interrupt, but how do you've got a lot of years of experience having this kind of conversation. So for somebody who doesn't, who might go, I'm a little nervous to talk to my friends about these big questions, let alone truth. Like that's a big question.
Big one.
How do you bring that up in a way that is not confrontational,
right,
but it does push a little bit?
Well, I ask, first of all, in that case, and I do this, I think, most of the time, I ask permission. And I tend to wait until it's way past the time I even need to ask for permission. Because, again, if we can establish that they're friends, we can talk about anything. I had a different conversation just this week that was really hard with someone I know, and I asked. I said, it's her and her boyfriend. I said, can I ask you guys anything? Can we talk about anything? And they were both, absolutely. And I think once someone knows that you love them and you're not going to judge them, that it opens the door for conversations about big questions. And so that's honestly my goal in all this is, can we keep this conversation going? And Lord, how can you allow it to go a little bit deeper?
And that's a really great principle and a thought to keep in mind as we're having these conversations, because oftentimes we want to get to the gospel really quick or with just one meeting.
Or close the deal. I mean, that's another one. It's like, I'm not a deal closer. It's not my job to close any deals. In this
it's God's
area,
deal anyway.
It's God's deal. I don't have to worry about it. Back to the question you asked about people who are nervous about that, I would just say, I would encourage people that people want to talk about these things. They don't have any place they can go and talk about these kinds of things. And so for you to be that space and to ask permission and to ask them to invite you in, it's almost like you've waited long enough with an adult child. I have 3 of those, for them to go, yeah, what do you think about this, Dad? And I get to go, you really want to know the answer to that? Because if you do, I'll tell you. And so that's kind of the same posture I'm trying to take with folks in this setting that we're talking about.
And maybe this is a good time, and I don't know where the conversation goes. We need to get back to where we're going. But the topic of truth came up, and you gave an answer, and that's even a divisive topic, right?
Sure.
Interesting one to me is that, often I hear a lot of believers want to push back on the idea of subjective truth.
Sure.
And they talk about objective or, outside of us. There's truth that's absolute. There's all these different words. And something that we found helpful is to acknowledge that there is subjective truth.
Absolutely.
There's a whole bunch of things that are subjective. It's not a bad thing to say there's subjective truth.
I will tell you where that has been rung true in my life is when someone would use a version of the line, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. My first thought is, well, you're just an idiot. That was my first internal thought, right? But
you
now,
have that thought with a lot of things.
Because a lot of people have it about me, and that's okay. But it's now my posture on that is that might be true. You might love football and I might not love football, or whatever the thing is. You might love apple pie and I don't. I don't know. But that's not as bad a statement as we've tended to think it is, in my opinion.
No, and like a way to look at it too is the subjective kinds of truths are that. I like the Seattle Seahawks because I was from Seattle. That's my favorite football team is the Seattle Seahawks, and that is my truth. It's a smaller and smaller number over the years. People who have that opinion, but there's things like that are true for a subject, and then there's things that are objective that are true or not true that are not based upon our opinions, and that's what a lot of people have called objective. And so the question with God, I think this is where I was trying to get to, is when we're talking with our friends, we want to help them see which category is this. Is God in the category of what's your favorite football team, or is God the kind of thing that's in the category of math or something that's true outside the universe exists? Right. That's true whether I feel like it or don't feel like it, or all. There's a whole bunch of other things that exist in that category. Which one does God fit best?
Great. And it was teed up for me. I didn't have to bring up the topic of truth. He's the one who brought up the idea that he didn't think there were any absolutes outside of math and science. And so it's teed up for me to have a conversation like that. And
so did you guys continue talking about that?
It was really interesting. I don't think I said this, but what happened next is he's thinking, he continued to think, he's going, yeah, maybe that is possible. And I said, and if there is, I want to know what that truth is, because it seems like my eternity might be at risk or on the line here.
Sure.
And that rang true for him. And he, from that point forward, posed all the big questions about life and God that we talk about in Search. I mean, he strung 4 or 5 of them together. He's like, so how do you think the Bible's like absolutely true? How do you know that? And what about people who haven't heard about Jesus? Is that still, I mean, he just keeps stringing these questions together, which led to more and more conversations. And I think the beautiful thing about this story is it wasn't just me who continued with the conversation, because the guest who brought him is also a friend of mine, and he was able to continue his conversations where I had left off. Another thought in this is a thought that we tell people in Dallas all the time. We feel the pressure of having to close a deal, or we want to take credit or take blame when folks don't give their life to Christ. But really, our job is like their life is a cup, and we're just putting another drop in. And I don't know who else has put drops in that guy's life. And someday we're really blessed and we get to be the person who puts the last drop in that bubbles over into faith. That wasn't me this time. But all along the way, I was putting drops in.
And every person putting a drop in is just as important and valuable.
And I actually think it was sweeter. Not that I didn't want to have that experience, because that's a sweet experience when I've had it. I thought it was sweeter that the guy who brought him and who was really his longtime friend was the guy who he finally looked at and he goes, this world's getting really bad. I need a savior. You've been right the whole time. And it was just beautiful. I don't even know what else to say about it. It was one of those that you go, I don't know if that went according to the playbook, but it kind of felt like it did a little bit.
Well, there is no playbook.
Right,
I mean, that's part of the deal with
right.
these. That's part of why we're doing this podcast, is to just help everyone see that every conversation is different. It really is different. And there are patterns, there are themes, there's things that come up a lot, but you just got to be in the moment and take it where God takes it.
And I think I have to be willing all the time to go, I'm willing to take a risk for the gospel. And my risk was so small. I mean, what was my risk? That he would say no, he didn't want to go to coffee? That he'd walk out of there thinking I was stupid? I mean, and didn't want to see me again? Okay, I didn't make a decision to engage in a conversation because of something that a guy who's never going to want to see me again said. That doesn't even make sense in my head. But it's still, relational equity with adults is risky, and I get that it's risky. It's not like with a high school kid or it's somebody you're doing life with. You're going to see them again, likely.
So if you were to boil down one lesson from this particular conversation that you'd want everybody to leave with, what would be the one takeaway?
I would say this whole thing took weeks and months to develop. And I would probably say you need to pray for eyes to see when it's time for you to take your turn to put a drop in someone's cup. And trust that God will allow that to be great, and it'll work out exactly as he had planned. But in some ways, it's almost more about, are we willing to do what God's asked us to do? Way more, as much as it is that guy and telling him about Jesus.
Yeah.
So There you go.
Great conversation, great takeaway.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, David.
You bet.
Enjoyed having you.
Same.
Thanks for listening to the Reach Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. That'd be a good idea. Share it with a friend and leave us a review to help others find the podcast. Now, for more resources, please visit reachothers.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we'd love to hear from you.